One Saturday afternoon Henry was sitting on the front steps amusing Ribsy by throwing a stick for him to retrieve. Every time Henry tossed the stick out onto the lawn, Ribsy bounded after it, brought it back, and dropped it at Henry's feet. Then Ribsy wagged his tail and waited for Henry to throw the stick again. Henry decided that since his dog was so smart about fetching sticks, he would teach him to bring his father's slippers or something useful. While Henry and Ribsy were playing, Scooter McCarthy rode up on his bicycle and tossed the Huggins copy of the Journal onto the grass. "Say, Huggins," he said, "I'm going to scout camp during Easter vacation next week, and I wondered if you knew anybody I could get to take my paper route when I'm gone." Henry tossed the stick for Ribsy again. "I'll take it, Scooter. I've always wanted to deliver papers." Scooter looked doubtful. "Aw, you're not old enough." Henry knew that journal carriers had to be 11 years old, but he said it wouldn't matter for 3 days, would it? It would still be your route and I'd just be a substitute. "Aw, come on, Scoot, let me do it." "You don't have a bike," said Scooter, "and I could only pay $1. "I could walk," said Henry, "and it's all right about the dollar, too." He wouldn't admit it to Scooter, but he thought the dollar would be a lot of money to add to his bike fund all at once. "Please, Scooter, I won't make mistakes or anything." "I've got some pretty cross customers on my route," warned Scooter. "That old Mrs. Jones phones the Journal office if just one teeny corner of her paper gets in the mud, and Mrs. Green gets mad if I throw the paper in her flower boxes. You have got to be careful when you deliver papers." "I could do it," said Henry. "I'd be real careful. Honest, I would." "Well," Scooter thought a minute. "All right, you can take the route, but you better not get me in trouble. I'll give you a list of customers next week." "Gee, thanks, Scooter," said Henry gratefully. Jeepers, another dollar for his bike fund. Henry made up his mind he'd do such a good job delivering papers that Scooter would want him to take the route when he went away during summer vacation. Then he would really make some money for the fund. He could see himself walking down Klickitat Street throwing papers onto porches with an experienced flip of the wrist. Still better, he pictured himself riding down the street on a shiny red bike with his snap-on raccoon tail floating from the handlebars. Boy, he was getting closer to that bike all the time. Then he noticed the tightly rolled journal lying on the lawn. That gave him an idea. Instead of training Ribsy to fetch his father's slippers, he would teach him to bring in the paper every night. "Fetch, Ribsy," he said. "Fetch the paper." Ribsy sat, thumping his tail on the lawn. "Aw, come on." Henry picked up the paper and held it under Ribsy's nose. Then he threw it. Still Ribsy sat. He was used to fetching sticks, not newspapers. He turned and chewed at a flea on his back. "Come on, you old dog." Henry showed Ribsy the paper again. Ribsy glanced at it and settled himself with his nose on his paws. Henry threw the paper half a dozen times, but Ribsy paid no attention. Thinking how silly he must look throwing a paper and fetching it himself while his dog watched, Henry held the journal behind his back. With his other hand he picked up the stick. "Ribsy, look!" he ordered. At the sight of the stick, Ribsy sprang to his feet. "Ruff!" he said, wagging his tail expectantly. Henry pretended he was going to throw the stick. Instead, he tossed the paper. Before he knew the difference, Ribsy bounded after it and caught it in his mouth. When the dog dropped the paper at his feet, Henry patted him. "Good dog, Ribsy," he said. "Good old Ribsy." Ribsy wriggled and wagged his tail with delight. The next time Henry threw the paper, he sprang to fetch it. "Good dog," Henry said approvingly. "I guess you're just about the smartest dog around here." The next day was Sunday. Henry, who always woke up earlier than his mother and father, decided to read the funnies in the journal, which was delivered early on Sunday morning. He tiptoed out to the porch, expecting to pick up the paper as he always did. Instead, he stood staring in horror at what he just saw. There was not just one journal on the doormat. There was a whole pile of them. Ribsy sat beside the papers, wagging his tail and looking pleased with himself. Henry groaned. "Did you pick up all these and bring them here?" he asked Ribsy in a whisper. Thump, thump, thump. Ribsy wagged his tail. Then he stood up and wagged his whole body. "You old dog," muttered Henry crossly as he counted the papers. There were 17 journals on his doormat. Fortunately, the Oregonian carrier was late this morning. What if Ribsy had collected 2 kinds of newspapers and piled them on the doormat? 17 journals! Henry wondered how he could ever face Scooter, and now he wouldn't get to earn that dollar either. He wouldn't get to deliver the papers when Scooter went to camp during summer vacation. But worst of all was the way Scooter would behave after this. He would never, never forget that Henry's dog had got him in trouble with his journal customers. Henry scowled at Ribsy, who looked puzzled because he hadn't been praised for retrieving all these papers. Henry knew he had to think of something, and fast, too. Then he remembered that Klickitat Street was the beginning of Scooter's route, and because it was so early, Scooter was probably still delivering papers. "Come on, Ribsy," he ordered, hurrying to his room. There he pulled on jeans and a sweater over his pajamas and shoved his feet into sneakers. He shut Ribsy in the room, grabbed the papers on the porch, except for one copy which he had tossed into the living room, and ran down the street as fast as he could to Scooter's house. No one on Klickitat Street was up at that hour, and Henry was relieved to see the blind still down on Scooter's house. He tiptoed up the front steps and, after looking uneasily up and down the street and listening for sounds from within the house, laid the 16 journals on the doormat. Then he ran home as fast as he could. After entering as quietly as he could, Henry threw himself on his bed with a gasp of relief. No one had seen him. Scooter would never know how the 16 papers found their way back to his doormat. The dollar for the bike fund was safe. Henry felt unusually cheerful after his narrow escape and was enjoying a second helping of hot cakes when the doorbell rang. Mr. Huggins answered it, and Henry heard Scooter say, "Here's your paper, Mr. Huggins. I'm sorry it was late." Holding his breath, Henry looked at the breakfast table, strewn with the Sunday Journal. Mr. Huggins said, "There must be some mistake, Scooter. We have our paper." "You have?" Scooter sounded surprised. "You're the only people on Klickitat Street that have one." "Henry, where did you find the paper this morning?" asked Mr. Huggins. "On the doormat." Well, he had found it on the doormat. His father didn't ask what else he had found, did he? "Sure is funny," repeated Scooter. "I know I delivered all the papers, but... Well, thanks anyway, Mr. Huggins." "It sure is funny." Jeepers, thought Henry. Now he had done it. Why hadn't he thought of putting his own paper on Scooter's doormat along with the others? Now Scooter would get suspicious and might figure out what had happened. Mr. Huggins folded back the sports section. "Isn't it funny that Scooter's papers should disappear from Klickitat Street?" he remarked to no one in particular. "When I used to deliver papers when I was a kid, I had a lot of trouble with dogs stealing them." Henry looked sharply at his father, but Mr. Huggins appeared to be interested in the paper. "What did you do about it?" asked Henry, as if he were just making polite conversation. "Sprinkled red pepper on the papers for a while until the dogs learned to leave them alone," answered Mr. Huggins, pouring himself another cup of coffee. After breakfast, Henry waited until his mother had finished the dishes. Then he quietly found the can of red pepper in an old newspaper and called Ribsy out into the backyard, where he was sure Scooter couldn't see him. He rolled the paper, sprinkled it with red pepper, and threw it out onto the grass. Ribsy ran over to it, stopped, and sniffed. He walked all the way around the paper, sniffing. Then he rolled it over with his paw before he picked it up carefully by one end and dropped it at Henry's feet. He wagged his tail and looked pleased with himself. "You old dog," said Henry crossly. Ribsy jumped up on Henry and looked so eager that Henry couldn't help petting him. "What am I going to do with you anyway?" he asked. Then he sprinkled pepper on the paper again and tossed it onto the grass. Ribsy bounded after it. Again he sniffed, and rolled the paper with his paw before he picked it up and carried it to Henry. Henry had a feeling that although pepper might work with other dogs, it wasn't going to work with Ribsy. Anyway, he couldn't follow two paper boys around and sprinkle pepper on every single paper they delivered, could he? And then there was the shopping news besides. He would spend all his bike fund buying pepper. Henry sat down to think of another way to untrain Ribsy. He couldn't keep the dog shut in the house alone very long because he would howl and scratch on the door to get out. Mrs. Huggins didn't like scratches on her woodwork, and the neighbors didn't like to hear Ribsy howl. He couldn't tie the dog up either. It never took Ribsy long to chew through a rope or leash. Henry tried to think what Ribsy didn't like. He didn't like to have his tail pulled. Henry thought about pulling his tail every time he picked up a paper, but that would hurt Ribsy. Ribsy didn't like the egg he was supposed to eat once a week so he would have a glossy coat, but Henry didn't see how he could give him an egg every time he stole a paper. Henry couldn't think of anything else Ribsy didn't like except bass. Ribsy was really a very agreeable dog. While Henry was still trying to think of a way to untrain Ribsy, he heard Scooter calling. He quickly put the pepper and the paper inside the back door and ran around the house. What would he say as Scooter guessed? "Hi! Sure is funny how you got a paper when nobody else on the street did, isn't it?" "Yeah," said Henry, wondering how he could change the subject. "And you know what?" asked Scooter. "What?" said Henry, knowing very well what. "I know I delivered those papers, and when I got home, I found 16 papers on my porch." "Jeepers!" Henry did his best to look surprised. Why couldn't a fire engine or something come down Klickitat Street right now? He heard the jingle of Ribsy's license tag. The dog trotted around the corner of the house and, after scratching, settled himself at Henry's feet. Then he suddenly sat up and looked toward the Grumbys' house next door. Henry looked too, and what he saw gave him a terrible sinking feeling in his stomach. There in plain sight on the front steps lay the Grumby's Oregonian news. Ribsy jumped to his feet, and Henry knew he had to do something in a hurry or Ribsy would retrieve the Gumby's paper before Scooter's very eyes. Shuddering at the thought of what would happen if he did, Henry hastily grabbed his dog around the neck. "Good old Ribsy," he said, hanging on tight. Ribsy squirmed. Henry wished as hard as he could that Scooter would just go home. "If anything happens to the papers tomorrow afternoon, I guess I had better not go to scout camp," said Scooter. "If I lose my route, I won't have the money to go to camp during summer vacation." Henry didn't answer. He was too busy trying to hang on to Ribsy without looking as if he were holding him. Ribsy strained toward the Grumby's paper. Henry turned the dog's head in the opposite direction, but the minute he let go, Ribsy whimpered and tried to get at the paper. "What's the matter with that dog, anyway?" asked Scooter. "Why don't you let him go?" "He doesn't want to go," said Henry. "Do you, Ribsy?" Ribsy whimpered and struggled to get out of Henry's arms. Henry couldn't see why Scooter had to hang around so long anyway. Why couldn't he just go home? Henry tried not to look at the paper on the Grumby's front steps, but it was all he could think about. Then the Grumby's front door opened and Mr. Grumby, wearing his bathrobe and slippers, walked sleepily out onto the porch, picked up the paper, and went into the house again. Ribsy relaxed and Henry let go of him. "Whew, that was close." Henry looked anxiously up and down the street to see if he could see any other papers. Instead, he saw Beezus and her little sister Ramona. The two girls stopped in front of Henry's house. Beezus had a handful of wax paper. Ramona had a red plastic water pistol. She looked at Scooter, aimed, and shot a stream of water into his face. "You're dead," she announced. "I am not, and you cut that out." Scooter wiped his face with his sleeve. "Ramona, stop that or I'll have to take the pistol away from you," ordered Beezus. "Henry, come on over to the park with us. I've got a bunch of bread wrappers to sit on while we slide on the slides." "Okay," said Henry promptly, more because he wanted to get away from Scooter than because he wanted to go to the park. Still, it was a long time since he had waxed the slides by sitting on a bread wrapper. "Here, Ribsy," he called. Ribsy bounded out of the shrubbery with his license tag jingling. In his mouth was a shopping news, yellow with age, which he dropped at Henry's feet. Henry didn't have the courage to look at Scooter. Ribsy bounded into the bushes and came out with another old paper. Then he stood wagging his tail and looking at Henry. "I thought so, Henry Huggins," said Scooter accusingly. "I thought you knew something about my papers disappearing." "Well, maybe." Henry didn't know what to say. Now he was really in trouble. A stream of water from Ramona's pistol hit him in the eye. "Ah, cut that out," he said, wiping his face. As if he didn't have enough trouble without a little kid shooting him with a water pistol. "I bet you trained that mutt of yours to steal papers." Scooter was really angry. "I suppose you're going to let him steal my papers all the time and make me lose my route." "No, he won't," promised Henry. "I'll untrain him." "You better untrain him," interrupted Scooter angrily. "And I'm going to find somebody else to take my route while I'm gone, too. I've had enough trouble with papers getting in the mud and stuff without having your old mutt going around stealing them." "You got the papers delivered again this morning before anybody complained, didn't you?" asked Henry. "Yes, because I started extra early in the first place, that's why. But what about tomorrow when I have to deliver them after school?" That was just what Henry had been asking himself. What about tomorrow? He had to think of something fast if he didn't want to lose $1 from his bike fund. "I'll tell you what, Scooter. You make me a list of your customers and I'll deliver the papers tomorrow night, free of charge. And if I do it right and Ribsy doesn't take any, I get to deliver the papers while you're gone. How about it?" Henry waited anxiously for Scooter's answer. "That's fair," said Beezus. Scooter scowled and thought over Henry's offer. "Okay," he said at last. "Maybe that way you'll be sure to untrain him." "It's a deal," said Henry. Now all he had to do was figure out how to keep Ribsy from stealing papers. Scooter started home and then turned back. "But just you remember, if you make me lose my route, I'll do something." While the two boys were arguing, Robert had joined the group in the front yard. "Scooter's pretty mad, isn't he?" he asked. "I'm glad I'm not in your shoes." "Yeah." Henry looked at the papers at his feet. "Jeepers, how am I going to get Ribsy untrained by tomorrow afternoon? Nothing I try works." "It's easy," said Robert. "You've got to make him afraid of what he steals. Hit him with the paper a few times and he'll get the idea." "I'll try," said Henry, "but I bet it won't work with Ribsy." "Don't hit him too hard," begged Beezus. Ribsy came trotting across the lawn with an old paper in his mouth. When he dropped it at Henry's feet, Henry picked it up and rapped him on the head with it. He didn't hit hard enough to hurt, just hard enough so he would get the idea. Ribsy was delighted. He growled a pretended growl and grabbed the paper. Henry hung on and so did Ribsy. Wagging his tail, the dog growled and tugged. Henry managed to yank the paper away. This time he hit Ribsy a little harder. Ribsy gave a joyful bark and sprang at the paper. He snatched it from Henry and worried it, then he settled down to chew it to pieces. "See what I mean?" said Henry. It was bad enough to have a dog that stole papers, but it was worse to have one that chewed them to bits. Henry could see Klickitat Street strewn with chewed-up journals. After school the next day, Henry joined Ribsy, who was waiting under the fir tree, and ran home with his dog as fast as he could. Then he changed into his after-school clothes, fixed himself some bread and peanut butter, and, after shutting Ribsy in his room, went out on the front porch to wait for Scooter. In a few minutes, Robert joined him. "Thought of anything yet?" he asked. "No," admitted Henry. "I shut Ribsy in the house, but he won't stay there very long." Ribsy appeared at the window with his front feet on the sill. He whimpered and scratched at the glass with one paw. "Go away," ordered Henry. Ribsy ran to the front door, where Henry could hear him scratching on the wood. Then Mrs. Huggins opened the door and said, "Henry, you'll just have to keep this dog outdoors with you." "Okay, Mom," answered Henry, looking at Robert. "See what I mean?" Then Beezus and her little sister Ramona joined the boys on the steps. Ramona promptly shot Robert with her water pistol. "You're dead," she shouted. Robert wiped his face with his sleeve. "I am not dead. I can't be dead if I'm not playing, now can I?" Then Scooter appeared, lugging a bundle of newspapers which he threw down on the walk in front of Henry's house. He handed Henry a list of addresses. "Be sure you remember about Mrs. Green's flower boxes," he said, "and I better not get any complaints about missing papers tonight or any other night." "You won't," said Henry, but he didn't sound very sure about it. Ramona fired a shot at the departing Scooter. Beezus said, "Come on, we'll help you." Keeping a wary eye on Ramona's water pistol, the other three began to roll newspapers. Henry was so busy watching the pistol that he forgot to watch Ribsy. Before he knew it, the dog had snatched a paper and had begun to worry it to pieces. "Ribsy!" yelled Henry. "Drop that!" Ribsy shook the paper harder. Henry grabbed one end of the paper. Ribsy hung on. Then Ramona raised her water pistol and aimed. A stream of water hit Ribsy in the face. "You're dead!" shouted Ramona. And Ribsy dropped the paper. Looking puzzled, he backed away and shook himself. "Hey, did you see that?" Henry jumped up and tripped over the papers in his excitement. "Ribsy dropped the paper. Ramona made him drop it. Do it again, Ramona." "No," said Ramona. "Aw, come on," coaxed Henry. "Beezus, make her shoot Ribsy again. This has just got to work." "No," said Ramona. Scooter came riding down the street on his bicycle. "You started delivering my papers yet?" he asked. "In a minute," said Henry. "You just wait. Everything's going to be all right." "It better be." Scooter looked threatening as he rode away. "And you better get going," he yelled back. Henry ran into the house and found his own plastic water pistol. After loading it at the kitchen sink, he ran outdoors and threw a paper at Ribsy. When the dog picked it up, Henry let him have a stream of water right in the face. Ribsy dropped the paper and backed away. Looking puzzled and embarrassed, he shook himself. "It works!" shouted Henry. "It really works! I'm going to get Ribsy untrained after all." He ran to the house again and filled his army surplus canteen with water, in case he needed to reload the pistol. Beezus and Robert had the papers rolled and stuffed into the canvas bag, which Henry now lifted over his head. The journals were heavier than he expected. "Come on," he said. "Let's go." By then, Beezus had succeeded in getting the water pistol away from Ramona. "I'll help you keep Ribsy covered," she said. Henry threw a journal onto the lawn of the first house on the list. Ribsy bounded after the paper, but the minute he opened his mouth to pick it up, Henry and Beezus shot him with 2 streams of water. Looking surprised and unhappy, Ribsy backed away from the paper and shook himself. The next time Henry threw a paper, Ribsy approached it cautiously. The instant he touched it, Beezus and Henry opened fire. This time Beezus shot from the hip. "You're dead!" shrieked Ramona. Ribsy decided he was not interested in the paper after all. The third time Henry threw a paper, Ribsy ignored it. He was too busy sniffing a bush to even look at it. "Good dog," said Henry, bending over to pet him. The weight of the papers in the canvas bag nearly tripped him over. Ribsy wagged his tail. "Good old Ribsy," said Henry proudly. Ribsy was untrained at last. When the children returned after delivering all the papers without a single mistake, they found Scooter waiting on the front steps. "How many did your mutt run off with?" he wanted to know. "He isn't a mutt, and he didn't run off with any," boasted Henry. "He wouldn't touch a paper. See?" Henry tossed his own copy of the journal onto the grass. Ribsy looked the other way. "I guess I did a pretty good job of delivering papers," bragged Henry. "You won't get any complaints tonight." "That's right," agreed Beezus. "I checked every address on the list with him just to make sure." Scooter threw one leg over his bicycle. "And I get to deliver papers while you're away, don't I?" Henry was thinking of his bike fund again, now that Ribsy was untrained. Sure, said Scooter, if you don't think it's too hard for a kid without a bike. You just wait, said Henry. I bet I get that bike sooner than you think. Ha! Said Scooter, pedaling down the street. You're dead, shrieked Ramona, squirting her pistol with deadly accuracy.